She stepped off the stagecoach into a town where the man she came to marry was already in the ground, 2 weeks dead. And before she could cry, before she could think, before she could even set down her trunk, she heard the crowd. Three men were kneeling on a scaffold with ropes around their necks and a judge who smiled like he had already won. She had $300 in her coat. She had never spoken above a whisper in her life. And what she did next changed everything. This is the story of the bride who bought 3 lives with her last dollar and brought a corrupt empire to its knees. The stagecoach rattled west through country that had no name for kindness. Eliza Whitmore sat upright on the wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, her spine pressed against the seat back as though posture alone could hold her together. Outside the window, the world was changing. The flat brown prairie she had watched for 3 days was giving way to something older, something wilder. Pine forests climbed toward peaks still wearing last winter's snow. Rivers cut through valleys of stone and shadow their water so clear she could see the rocks at the bottom even from the road above. She was 22 years old. She was alone, and she was farther from everything she had ever known than she had imagined possible. Her trunk sat at her feet, wedged against the opposite bench. It contained everything she owned in this world: 2 dresses, 1 plain cotton, and 1 navy blue traveling dress she was wearing now. A sewing kit with needles her mother had given her. A leather-bound Bible with wildflowers pressed between the pages of Psalms, their colors fading but still visible if you held them to the light. 3 letters tied with a ribbon. And $47 in carefully saved wages from 4 years of stitching seams in a Boston garment factory. The letters were the reason she was here. She untied the ribbon and read the last one again, though she knew every word by heart. The handwriting was steady and unhurried, the letters of a man who took his time with things that mattered. "Dear Miss Whitmore," it began, "I am glad you have agreed to come. The store is doing well enough and the rooms above it are clean and warm. The mountains are something you will have to see for yourself because I do not have the words for them. I am a plain man with a good heart and a sturdy roof. I think that is enough to start with. If you are willing, I believe we can build something good together. Yours respectfully, Clayton Porter." Eliza touched the cameo brooch at her throat. It had been her mother's, the only fine thing Martha Whitmore ever owned. Carved ivory on a rose background, a woman's profile in silhouette. Her mother wore it every day, even in the tuberculosis ward, even at the end when she weighed less than the blankets they piled on her and her breathing sounded like paper tearing. Eliza had been 16 when her mother died. She had held Martha's hand and promised that everything would be all right, and they had both known it was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that love required. Her father lasted 2 more years. The printing press he ran had been mortgaged twice over, and when the debts came due, he had reached for the bottle instead of the ledger. Eliza came home from the factory one November evening to find him dead in his chair, an empty whiskey bottle in his hand, and an eviction notice on the table. He had not left a note. He had not needed to. His whole life had been the note, a long, slow letter of apology that he never figured out how to finish. After that, Eliza had lived in a boarding house on Milk Street and worked 14-hour shifts at the garment factory, sewing buttons onto shirts that cost more than she made in a week. The owner's son made comments about her figure. Her coworkers told her to be grateful for the attention. She ate bread and cheese for supper most nights and saved every penny she could squeeze from her wages, though she did not yet know what she was saving for. Then one morning she saw the advertisement in the Boston Herald tucked between notices for patent medicine and farm equipment. Respectable store owner in Montana Territory seeks wife. Must be willing to work and build a life in mountain country. No fortune required. Only a good heart and a strong will. Write to Clayton Porter, Silver Falls, Montana Territory. She had written that same evening, and Clayton had written back within 3 weeks, and then again and again. 3 letters over 4 months, each one warmer than the last, each one painting a picture of a life she had never dared to imagine for herself. A store of her own, mountains, clean air, a man who said please and thank you and meant both. She had never been west of Philadelphia. She had never been kissed. She had packed her trunk and boarded a train and then a stagecoach and traveled 2,000 miles toward a man she had never met, carrying nothing but hope and $47 in her mother's brooch. And now the mountains were getting closer and the road was getting rougher, and somewhere ahead in a town called Silver Falls, Clayton Porter was waiting for her. Or so she believed. The stagecoach driver, an older man named Harwick, with tobacco-stained teeth and kind eyes, had been quiet for the last hour. Eliza had noticed. When she first boarded in Bozeman, he had been talkative, full of stories about the territory, the weather, the mining camps. But as they drew nearer to Silver Falls, his stories dried up. He kept glancing back at her through the window with an expression she could not read. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself the knot in her stomach was just nerves. She told herself that in less than an hour she would step off the stagecoach and meet the man who would become her husband, and that everything she had endured, the factory, the loneliness, the years of saving and hoping and being invisible, would finally mean something. She pressed her mother's brooch against her collarbone and watched the mountains grow closer, and she practiced what she would say. "Mr. Porter, I am Eliza. I have come a long way to meet you." The stagecoach rounded a bend, and Silver Falls appeared below them like a painting. A single main street lined with wooden buildings, their paint faded by sun and weather. A courthouse at one end, stone and imposing with narrow windows, and a bell tower. A church at the other end, white clapboard with a crooked steeple. Between them, the ordinary machinery of frontier life. A saloon, a smithy, a boarding house, a printing press, a general store on the corner of Main and Ash, with a sign that read, "Porter's Mercantile." But something was wrong. Eliza felt it before she understood it. The street was too full for midday on a weekday. People were moving in one direction, and all of them flowing toward the town square like water toward a drain. There was a sound rising from the crowd, a low murmur that she could hear even over the rattle of the stagecoach wheels, and it was not the sound of commerce or conversation. It was the sound of anticipation, the sound of a crowd that had come to watch something happen. The stagecoach pulled to a stop in front of the general store. Eliza gathered her skirts and stepped down into the dust, blinking against the sharp mountain light. The air was different here. Thinner, colder, carrying the smell of pine and snow and something else, something metallic like the taste of a storm that had not yet arrived. She looked for Clayton Porter. He was supposed to meet the stagecoach. He had said so in his last letter. "I will be there when you arrive. You will know me by my apron and my bad haircut." He was not here. The driver climbed down and began unloading her trunk. He moved slowly, deliberately, and he didn't look at her. "Mr. Harwick," Eliza said, "could you tell me where I might find Mr. Porter? He was expecting me." Harwick's hands stilled on the trunk. He straightened and removed his hat, turning it in his fingers. It was the gesture of a man preparing to deliver news he wished he did not carry. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I think you had better talk to someone at the store. Mr. Porter's place is right there, corner of Main and Ash." He set her trunk on the boardwalk. "I am sorry." The way he said sorry made Eliza's stomach drop. It was not a casual sorry. It was the sorry people use when something has broken beyond repair, and they do not know how to say so plainly. She walked to the store on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Porter's Mercantile. The sign read its letters, sun-faded and slightly crooked. The front door was locked. A note was tacked to the wood in handwriting she did not recognize, closed until further notice. Through the dusty window, she could see shelves half-stocked with goods. A counter worn smooth by 20 years of hands. A ledger lying open as though its owner had stepped away for just a moment and intended to return. But Clayton Porter was not going to return. A woman passing by, thin and sharp-featured, with a mouth that looked like it had been designed for delivering bad news, noticed Eliza staring through the window. "If you are looking for Clayton Porter," the woman said with the casual cruelty of someone delivering another person's tragedy, "you are about 2 weeks too late. Hart gave out in his sleep. Buried him in the churchyard last Tuesday." The ground tilted. Eliza gripped the porch railing. The wood was rough under her fingers, full of splinters, and she held on because if she let go, she was not sure she would remain standing. Dead. The man she had crossed a continent to marry was dead. "Are you all right, dear?" the woman Mrs. Howard asked, though her tone suggested she did not much care either way. "I was his intended," Eliza said. The words came out flat, stripped of everything except fact. "His mail-order bride." Mrs. Howard's eyebrows rose to a height that suggested she had not known eyebrows could travel that far. Something between pity and judgment crossed her face, settling into an expression that was neither. "Well, that is unfortunate. You might want to talk to the lawyer about the will." She nodded toward the courthouse. "But I would wait if I were you. The whole town is at the square right now. There is a hanging. Mrs. Howard walked away without looking back, and Eliza stood alone on the porch of a dead man's store, holding a dead man's letters in a town she had never seen before, with nowhere to go and no one to call her name. She should have sat down on that porch and wept. She should have waited for the lawyer collected whatever pittance Clayton's will might leave her, and bought a stagecoach ticket back to Boston and the factory and the life she had been desperate enough to flee. Instead, she walked to the courthouse first. The lawyer, a tired man named Whitfield, confirmed what Mrs. Howard had said and handed Eliza a key and a leather pouch. Clayton Porter had left everything to the bride he never met, the store, its inventory, and $300 in savings. Eliza signed the papers in a daze, tucked the pouch into her coat, and walked out into the street. The crowd was still moving toward the square. She followed it. She did not know why. Perhaps it was the same instinct that had made her answer Clayton's advertisement in the first place. The refusal to stand still when standing still felt too much like giving up. The stubborn, bone-deep conviction that had kept her alive through 4 years of poverty and loneliness, that she was meant for more than this, and if she just kept moving, she would find out what more looked like. The town square was packed. 200 people pressed close to a wooden scaffold erected at its center, a crude platform raised 4 feet off the ground with 3 vertical beams, 3 crossbars, and 3 ropes. The nooses hung like question marks against a sky too blue for dying. On the platform, 3 men knelt. Their wrists were bound behind them with rope that looked like it had been used for livestock. Their clothes were torn and dirty, stained with the grime of weeks in a cell. Their faces bore the marks of fists and short rations, bruises, yellowing at the edges, cheekbones too sharp under skin, stretched tight. But even kneeling, battered and bound, they were enormous. The first, the tallest, had dark blonde hair falling across his face and eyes the color of amber held up to firelight. His jaw was set with the kind of defiance that does not shout or snarl, but simply refuses quietly and absolutely to break. There was a scar across his ribs, visible through a tear in his shirt, a clean line that spoke of a knife fight survived and a lesson learned. His name was Silas Calloway, and he was 35 years old, and he had been kneeling on this platform for 20 minutes, and he had not once lowered his gaze. The second was slightly leaner, but no less powerful, with chestnut brown hair and hazel eyes that moved across the crowd with the precise cataloging attention of a man who noticed everything and forgot nothing. His name was Gideon Calloway, and he was 31, and even now, with a noose around his neck and death minutes away, his mind was working, calculating angles, measuring odds, looking for the gap in the wall that no one else could see. The third was the youngest. Auburn hair catching copper in the sun, a face that looked like it had been built for laughter, but had forgotten how. His eyes were blue-gray, the color of mountain sky before a storm, and they were fixed on the heavens above him, as though he were trying to memorize the blue. His name was Josiah Calloway, and he was 27, and his lips were moving silently, shaping words that might have been a prayer or might have been a name. 3 brothers, 3 ropes, 1 crime they did not commit. Judge Harlan Graves stood at the edge of the platform, immaculate in a black judicial coat buttoned to the throat. His silver-streaked hair was combed smooth despite the wind, and his posture carried the practiced ease of a man who had never been questioned and did not expect to start now. He was 56 years old, and he had been the law in Silver Falls for 12 of those years, and the law had been good to him. His voice carried over the crowd with the measured cadence of absolute authority. Silas Calloway, Gideon Calloway, Josiah Calloway. He unfolded a paper he did not need to read. Everyone in Silver Falls knew the charges by heart. They had been the only topic of conversation for 6 weeks. You stand accused of the murder of Edmund Thorne, landowner and respected member of this community. Though no trial by jury was conducted due to the severity of witness testimony and the risk of escape, this tribunal has found sufficient evidence to warrant execution by hanging. May God have mercy on your souls. Silas's jaw tightened. His amber eyes scanned the crowd, not searching for rescue, but for the faces he knew were lying. He found them easily. Wade Henley, the judge's chief enforcer, a former cavalry sergeant with flat eyes and a hand resting on his pistol. Frank Aldridge from the land office, looking everywhere except at the scaffold. Men in clean hats, men whose boots were not scuffed by honest work, men whose smiles did not reach past their teeth. Edmund Thorne had owned half the grazing land south of town and had wanted the rest. Specifically, he had wanted 20 acres of mountain land near Stillwater Creek land that Silas Calloway's Crow mother had shown him as a boy long before the treaties broke and the borders closed. Land the three brothers had lived on, hunted on, trapped on, and loved for their entire lives. Thorne had sent men with guns. Silas had sent them back bleeding. A week later, Thorne was found dead at the bottom of a ravine, his skull cracked, his pockets empty. The brothers had not done it, but no one with power cared about that because the brothers were half Crow and owned land that powerful men wanted, and in Montana Territory in 1876, that was enough to hang. Lyle Dawson, the executioner, a thick-shouldered man with the mechanical indifference of someone who had learned to see people as tasks, adjusted the first noose around Silas's neck. The rope was rough braided hemp that scratched like a promise the town had been waiting 6 weeks to keep. Dawson moved to Gideon, tightening the second noose with the same practiced efficiency, then to Josiah. Josiah closed his eyes when the rope touched his throat. His shoulders trembled, once, then stilled. Whatever he was saying, he finished it. He opened his eyes and looked at the sky one more time, and something in his expression shifted from prayer to acceptance. The crowd pressed closer. The murmuring rose. The lever that would drop the trapdoors gleamed dully in the midday sun, and at the back of the crowd, standing alone in a navy blue traveling dress, with dust on her hem, and grief she had not yet had time to feel pressing against her ribs, Eliza Whitmore watched three men she had never met prepare to die. She did not know them. She did not know if they were guilty. She knew nothing about this town, its politics, its buried lies, its careful hierarchies of power and silence. But she knew what a rigged game looked like. She had grown up in a garment factory where the owner docked wages for imaginary offenses and fired anyone who complained. She had watched her father destroyed by men who held debts over his head like weapons. She had lived her entire adult life inside a system designed to keep people like her silent, obedient, and grateful for whatever scraps fell from the table. And she saw in the judge's smooth confidence, in the crowd's trained compliance, in the absence of a jury, in the way the three men on the platform had been beaten but refused to be broken. She saw the shape of something she recognized. Not just injustice, something worse. Injustice wearing the robes of law. Something shifted inside her. Not courage exactly, something deeper and more reckless. A door opened that she did not know existed, and behind it was a voice she had never used, and the voice said, "Not this, not today, not while you are standing here with breath in your lungs and words in your mouth." Lyle Dawson reached for the lever. "I will pay their debt." The voice was not loud. It trembled at the edges like a candle flame in a draft. But it cut through the noise of 200 murmuring voices like a blade through rotted wood, and every head in the square turned. Eliza Whitmore stood in the dust, her traveling dress creased from 3 days on a stagecoach, her honey blonde hair escaping its pins in the dry mountain wind, a leather pouch clutched in her shaking hand. She was 5 feet 3 inches tall. She weighed less than any one of the men kneeling on that scaffold. She was terrified, and she had just stopped a hanging with 5 words. Judge Graves' expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened the way a hawk's eyes sharpen when it spots movement in the grass below. "Speak plainly, miss." Eliza's throat worked. She stepped forward, and the crowd parted around her. Not out of respect, but out of sheer bewilderment. Strangers did not interrupt hangings. Women did not interrupt hangings. Small, frightened girls in dusty dresses absolutely did not interrupt hangings. "I will pay their debt," she repeated louder sound. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. The territorial statute allows a condemned man's life to be purchased if restitution is made to the victim's family, and a bond is posted for future conduct. "I have the money." A ripple of laughter started somewhere in the back of the crowd and spread forward like a brush fire. "Sweetheart," a man's voice called from the middle of the throng, "you think you can buy yourself 3 men?" "Maybe she is building a collection," another voice added. More laughter, louder this time. Eliza's face flushed from her collar to her hairline. The heat of it burned, and she could feel every eye in the square pressing against her skin like a physical weight. But she did not lower her gaze. She did not step back. She walked straight to the platform, her boots kicking up dust with each step, and held out the leather pouch. $300. That is what the territorial statute allows per head. I have read the law. I have the right. Graves's mouth thinned into something that was not quite a smile. The statute exists for family members and business partners, miss, not passing strangers. It does not specify, Eliza said. Her hands were shaking so badly she could feel the coins clicking against each other, inside the pouch a tiny percussion of terror. It says any party willing to assume legal responsibility. I am willing. And who exactly are you? Oh, you, Eliza lifted her chin. It was a gesture her mother had taught her. When you are afraid, Martha Whitmore used to say, lift your chin. It does not make the fear go away, but it tells the fear that you are in charge of your own face, and that is a start. My name is Eliza Whitmore. I am Clayton Porter's intended bride. His will names me as heir to his store and its assets. That makes me a property owner and a taxpayer in this territory, and that gives me standing. The laughter died. The crowd went silent, the sudden absolute silence of 200 people collectively realizing that the small woman in the dusty dress was not joking. Graves's fingers drummed once against his coat. His eyes moved from Eliza's face to the pouch in her hand, from the pouch to the crowd, from the crowd back to Eliza. She could see the calculation happening behind his expression, the rapid weighing of options. He could refuse her. The statute was obscure enough that most people in the square had never heard of it. But refusing her meant admitting that the law he claimed to serve had provisions he chose to ignore, and that was a cake in the foundation he could not afford. You understand what you are proposing, Miss Whitmore? His voice was still smooth, still pleasant, but something cold had settled into it. You would be financially and legally liable for the conduct of 3 men. Any crime they commit, any debt they incur, it becomes yours. If they run you, forfeit the bond and face criminal penalty yourself. I understand. And you believe 3 half-breed drifters with no loyalty to law or decency deserve that kind of charity. The word charity came out of his mouth like something rotten. I believe 3 men deserve a fair trial, Eliza said. They did not get one. The square went silent. Not the confused silence of before, but a deeper, heavier silence. The silence of people hearing something true and not knowing what to do with it. Grace stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the crowd, spreading his hands, as though inviting their judgment, though both he and they knew he was inviting nothing of the kind. The law is the law, he said smoothly, and Miss Whitmore is correct. Territorial statute does allow for bond substitution in capital cases, provided the injured party's family consents, and the bond is posted in full. He looked back at Eliza. Edmund Thorne's widow has left the territory. His brother, however, remains. If he accepts your offer, and if you can post the bond here and now, I will commute the sentences to indenture. Eliza stepped up onto the platform. The wood creaked under her weight, though she weighed barely 100 pounds, and for one dizzying moment she was standing at the same height as the 3 kneeling men, looking out over a sea of upturned faces that stared at her with expressions ranging from contempt to fascination to something that in a few faces might have been the first faint stirring of hope. She poured the coins onto Judge Graves' outstretched palm. Gold eagles, silver dollars, worn bills folded tight, $300. Every cent of Clayton Porter's bequest, the money that was supposed to be her fresh start, her safety, her future. She spent it all on 3 strangers. Graves counted slowly, making a show of it, letting each coin ring against the others as it dropped from his fingers. The crowd watched in absolute silence. 300 even, he confirmed. He gestured to a clerk standing nearby, a thin man with a quill and an inkpot. Draw up the papers. On his knees with a noose still around his neck, Silas Calloway finally looked at her. She was nothing like what he expected. She was small where the world was large, soft where the territory was hard clean, where everything else was covered in dust and blood and the residue of lies. Her eyes were the color of cornflowers, a blue so vivid it seemed impossible in this landscape of brown and gray, and they were looking at him with an expression he could not decode. It was not pity, it was not calculation. It was something he had not seen directed at him in so long that he had forgotten its name. It was recognition. The clerk returned with a sheet of parchment and a pen. Graves read aloud in a voice meant to carry. By the authority vested in the territorial court, the death sentences of Silas Gideon and Josiah Calloway are hereby commuted to terms of indentured service duration of 5 years under the legal guardianship and financial responsibility of Miss Eliza Whitmore. They will reside on her property, labor under her direction, and submit to her authority in all matters of law and conduct. Failure to comply will result in immediate rearrest and execution of the original sentences. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Miss Whitmore, do you accept these terms? I do. Sign here. Eliza took the pen. Her hand trembled so badly the ink blotted on the first letter of her name, spreading like a dark flower across the parchment. But she pressed down and wrote her name in careful slanted script, the handwriting her mother had taught her, letter by letter, at the kitchen table of a mouse that no longer existed. Graves turned to the brothers. And you three, do you accept indenture in place of the noose? Silas's voice came out rough like gravel scraped over iron. Do not have much choice, do we? No, Graves said pleasantly. You do not. He gestured to Dawson, who loosened the nooses and hauled the brothers to their feet one by one. The executioner cut the ropes around their wrists, but immediately replaced them with iron manacles, the chains clinking as he locked them tight. Indenture is not freedom, Graves set his eyes on Eliza. His voice dropped, meant only for her now. It is ownership. They are yours to manage, Miss Whitmore. But if they stray, if they harm anyone, if they so much as set foot outside the town limits without written permission, the fault is yours, and the noose waits for all four of you. I understand. Graves handed her an iron key. Then he leaned in close, near enough that she could smell the pomade in his hair and the coffee on his breath. I wonder, he murmured, what Mr. Porter would say about this. Eliza's face went white, but she took the key. As Graves turned to leave the platform, Eliza caught something she had not expected. A tremor in his hand as he folded the papers. A flicker of something behind the calculation in his eyes that looked for just a moment like exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of a man who had worked a long day, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from carrying a weight that never gets lighter. She filed it away without understanding it. She would understand later when she learned about Eleanor Graves and the imported medicine, and the debts that had first cracked open the door through which all the corruption had eventually poured. The crowd began to disperse, muttering and laughing, already spinning the story into something ugly. Dawson shoved Silas forward and he stumbled off the platform, chains rattling. Gideon followed, silent and watchful. Josiah came last, blinking in the sunlight, like a man waking from a nightmare he was not yet certain had ended. They walked through the square in silence, Eliza in front, the three brothers behind, the space between them filled with stares and whispers that clung like cobwebs. Eastern girl bought herself 3 mountain men. What is she planning to do with them? And bet she does not last a week. Eliza kept her eyes forward. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She walked step by step toward the general store at the end of the street, the place that now belonged to her, the place where a dead man's life was waiting to be continued by someone who had never even seen his face. Porter's Mercantile sat on the corner of Main and Ash, a 2-story building with paint faded to the color of bone and a sign that had not been straightened since Clayton Porter lost the will to climb a ladder. The lower floor sold dry goods, tools, fabric, and ammunition. The upper floor was living quarters, 3 small rooms, a kitchen that smelled of old wood and older loneliness, and windows that looked out over a town that had just watched a stranger do the most foolish or the most courageous thing any of them had ever seen. Eliza unlocked the back door with the key the town lawyer had given her that morning, before the hanging, before everything. She led the brothers into the narrow storeroom. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with crates and barrels. The air smelled of flour and dust and the particular absence that fills a space when the person who made it home is gone. She set the manacle keys on a nearby crate. The 3 brothers stood in a line, filling the small room with their physical presence the way boulders fill a stream bed. Silas blocked the doorway simply by existing in it. Gideon stood perfectly still, his hazel eyes cataloging every detail of the room, the inventory, the exits, the structural weaknesses. Josiah shifted, his weight chains clinking, and stared at the keys with an expression that was half disbelief and half desperate hope. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint settling of the building and the muffled noise of the town outside carrying on with its afternoon, as though 3 men had not almost died in the square. Then Eliza exhaled. It was a long, shaking breath, the kind that marks the end of one thing and the uncertain beginning of another. I am going to unlock those chains, she said quietly. But you need to understand something first. Three pairs of eyes fixed on her, amber, hazel, blue-gray, waiting. I did not do this because I think you are innocent, Eliza continued. Her voice was steadier, now drawing strength from the words themselves, from the act of saying out loud the things she had not fully understood until she heard them leave her mouth. I do not know if you killed Edmund Thorne. Maybe you did. Maybe you did not. But I know that judge did not care either way. I know he wanted you dead because you would not sell your land. And I know he would have hanged you whether you were guilty or not. Silas's jaw tightened. Gideon tilted his head, the small, precise gesture of a man recognizing intelligence in someone unexpected. Josiah's eyes glistened, though he blinked it away quickly. I bought your lives because I am tired of watching powerful men decide who deserves to live and who does not. I spent my whole life watching that in Boston. I watched it destroy my father. I watched it kill my mother by inches. And I did not come 2,000 miles to watch it happen here. She picked up the first key and stepped toward Silas. He did not move. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. The height difference between them was almost comical, 5 feet 3 inches, looking up at 6 feet 5, but there was nothing comical about the moment. It was the most serious thing that had ever passed between two strangers. You are going to work for me, she said. You are going to follow the rules. If you run, if you hurt anyone, I lose everything. This store, this chance may be my freedom. So I need you to understand, I did not save you. I bought you. And if you make me regret it, the consequences fall on me. She unlocked his manacles. They fell to the floor with a heavy clang that echoed through the storeroom. Silas rubbed his wrists where the iron had bitten into his skin, his eyes never leaving hers. Why did you really do it? He asked. His voice was low, quiet, the voice of a man who did not waste words and expected the same from others. Eliza met his gaze. For a moment, something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but the recognition of two people who had each stared down something larger than themselves and refused to look away. Because someone had to, she said. She unlocked Gideon next. He examined his freed wrists with the methodical attention of a man taking inventory of damage. Then he looked up at her with quiet intensity. That statute you cited at the scaffold. It has not been invoked in 12 years. How did you know about it? I read, Eliza said simply. Gideon's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement that one might be earned. She unlocked Josiah last. He was the youngest and it showed. When the manacles fell, he exhaled a sound so raw and relieved that Eliza had to look away because the gratitude in it was too large for the small room to hold. Thank you, Josiah said. His voice cracked on the second word. I know you said we do not have to thank you, but thank you. Eliza nodded once. Then she turned businesslike, because if she let herself feel the full weight of what she had just done, she would collapse, and collapsing was a luxury she could not afford. There are 2 rooms upstairs. They are small. You will share. I will take the room at the end of the hall. You will eat after I close the store each evening. You work inventory deliveries, repairs, whatever I need. You do not talk to customers unless I say so. You do not leave the building without my permission. She looked at each of them in turn. And you do not ask me questions I am not ready to answer. Silas's expression was unreadable. Gideon nodded once, sharp and final. Josiah opened his mouth, closed it, then said softly, yes, ma'am. Eliza turned toward the stairs, then paused. One more thing. I do not think you killed him. Any of you. But thinking and knowing are different things. If you want me to trust you, give me a reason. She climbed the stairs without looking back. The 3 brothers stood alone in the storeroom, the weight of their chains gone, but the weight of everything else settling in like stones, laid one by one across their shoulders. Silas was the first to move. He picked up the fallen manacles, coiled the chains, and set them on a shelf with the careful deliberateness of a man putting away something he intended never to wear again. Then he looked at his brothers. Did that just happen? Josiah asked, still stunned. It happened, Gideon said quietly. He was already looking around the storeroom, reading labels on crates, assessing the inventory with the automatic precision of a mind that never stopped working. She spent everything, Silas said. His voice was rough with something he could not name. Every cent she had, on 3 men she has never met. Why? Josiah asked. Silas stared at the stairs where Eliza had disappeared. He could still see her in his mind, the small frame, the trembling hands, the chin lifted against fear. The cornflower blue eyes that looked at him and saw not a half-breed drifter, not a convicted killer, but a man. I do not know, Silas said, but I intend to be worth what she paid. That first evening, Eliza sat at Clayton Porter's desk in the small room that was now hers, a single candle burning low, and read his ledger by the unsteady light. The handwriting was steady and meticulous, the records of a careful man. Sales figures, inventory counts, supplier names, credit accounts. Ordinary numbers, telling an ordinary story. But between the numbers and the margins, Clayton had written notes, small observations, questions, things that did not add up. Land transfer south parcel below market value. Who approved Graves again? Third transaction this quarter. All to same holding company. Ask Beckett about article. Something wrong about Thorne death. The notes grew more frequent in the final months, more urgent, the handwriting pressing harder into the paper, as though the pen itself were angry. Clayton Porter had seen something. He had started pulling at a thread, and the thread had led him somewhere dangerous. And then 2 weeks before Eliza arrived, his heart had stopped in his sleep. She set the ledger down and stared at the wall. The candle flame flickered, casting long shadows that moved like living things. Clayton Porter had not died of a bad heart. She did not have proof, not yet. But she had the notes, and she had the instinct of a woman who had spent her whole life reading between the lines of what powerful men said and what they actually meant. Someone had killed Clayton Porter, and the same someone had killed Edmund Thorne, and the same someone had framed 3 innocent brothers for the murder, because dead men and convicted killers cannot ask questions, and questions were the one thing Judge Harlan Graves could not afford. The conspiracy was deeper than a scaffold and 3 ropes. It was deeper than land and money. It went all the way to the bench where the judge sat smooth and smiling, pronouncing death with the casual confidence of a man who had done it before and would do it again. And Eliza Whitmore, mail-order bride, from Boston orphan seamstress owner of a dead man's store, and guardian of 3 mountain men she had purchased with her last $300, sat alone in a candlelit room and understood with the cold clarity of someone who has just walked into a fight she did not start and cannot walk away from, that saving the Calloway brothers from the noose was only the beginning. The real battle had not even started yet. Downstairs in the storeroom, Silas Calloway lay awake on the thin cot Eliza had prepared, staring at the ceiling. He could hear his brothers breathing in the darkness. Gideon's breath was slow and even, the disciplined rhythm of a man who could sleep anywhere because he had trained himself to rest when rest was available. Josiah's breathing was ragged, broken by the small, involuntary sounds of a man whose body had not yet accepted that it was safe. Silas listened to them both. He had been listening to his brothers sleep since he was 14 years old, since the day their mother died of smallpox, and left him a boy barely old enough to shave, responsible for 2 smaller boys, in a world that had already decided they did not belong. He had taught them to hunt, to trap, to read the mountain weather by the way the wind moved through the pines, to build a fire that would last through a January night when the temperature dropped so low that the sap froze in the trees and the silence was so complete you could hear your own blood moving. He had built a cabin on 20 acres of mountain land near Stillwater Creek, land his mother had shown him as a boy, walking beside him through the aspens, pointing out the places where the elk crossed and the creek turned, and the wild berries grew so thick in August that you could fill a bucket in 10 minutes. She had said, "This is yours, Silas. This land knows your name. Do not let anyone take it from you." He had kept that promise for 21 years, through harsh winters and lean seasons, through the broken treaties and the closed borders and the slow systematic theft of everything his mother's people had ever called home. He had kept it by being harder than the men who came to take it, by fighting when fighting was necessary and waiting when waiting was wiser, by loving the land with the fierce protective love of a man defending the only thing left of the woman who raised him. And then Edmund Thorne had come with papers and guns and the backing of a corrupt judge, and Silas had fought one more time, and this time the consequence was not a scar across his ribs, but a noose around his neck and his brothers kneeling beside him. He had been ready to die. Not willing, but ready. There was a difference. Willing meant you wanted it. Ready meant you had made your peace with it because the alternative running, hiding, admitting guilt you did not carry, was worse than death. And then a voice had come from the back of the crowd, small and trembling and utterly certain. I will pay their debt. He closed his eyes and saw her face, the cornflower blue eyes looking up at him with that impossible expression of recognition, as though she could see past the dirt and the chains and the reputation to the man underneath. Why did you really do it? Because someone had to. Silas lay in the dark, listening to his brothers breathe, and thought about a girl from Boston who had spent everything she had to save three strangers. And he made a promise to himself, silent and absolute, the way his mother had taught him to make promises, by speaking them to the mountain inside his own heart, where no one else could hear. Whatever comes next, he thought, she will not face it alone. Outside, the town of Silver Falls settled into sleep. The scaffold still stood in the square, its ropes swaying gently in the night wind, empty now but patient. It would wait. Wood and rope are patient things. But inside the store on the corner of Main and Ash, four people who had nothing except each other and the truth were already beginning to build something the scaffold could not reach. They did not know it yet. They would learn. The first morning came too early and too bright. Eliza woke to the sound of boots on the floor below her, heavy and unfamiliar, moving, with the purposeful rhythm of men accustomed to rising before the sun. For 3 full seconds, panic filled her chest like cold water. 3 strangers. 3 men she had freed from a noose, moving through the building below her room while she slept. Then she heard Josiah laugh. It was short and quiet, the laugh of a man who had not expected to find anything funny, and was surprised by it, and the sound of it loosened something in Eliza's chest that she had not realized was clenched. She dressed quickly, pinning her hair with fingers that were steadier than yesterday, and descended the stairs. The storeroom had been transformed. In the hours since she had gone to bed, the brothers had reorganized shelves that Clayton Porter had left crooked for months. Crates that had been stacked haphazard were now aligned by category and weight. The floor had been swept clean for the first time in what looked like the better part of a year. The work was quiet, efficient, and thorough, the work of men who understood labor the way most people understood breathing. Silas was at the center of it. He moved through the space with the focused precision of a man who had built things his entire life, whose hands knew the language of wood and weight and angle the way a musician's hands know the strings. He did not look up when Eliza entered. You did not have to start yet, she said. Did not have anything else to do. Gideon was seated on an overturned crate near the counter, Clayton's ledger open on his knees, a stub of pencil behind his ear. He had been awake for hours, Eliza could tell, because the margins of the ledger page he was studying were already covered in his neat, precise handwriting. Your predecessor was honest but disorganized, Gideon said without looking up. He was buying flour from Henrikson's at 12% above Helena wholesale. His fabric margins are too thin because he matched Callahan's dress shop instead of undercutting, and he was carrying $600 in credit to customers who will never pay. Eliza blinked. Good morning to you, too. Gideon glanced up and something like embarrassment flickered across his weathered face. Good morning. The margins are still a problem. Josiah emerged from the back carrying a barrel of salt pork that should have required 2 men to lift. He carried it as though it were a basket of eggs. I found breakfast, he announced. It is not good breakfast, but it exists. The 4 of them ate together at the workbench. Salt pork, stale bread, and black coffee that Eliza brewed strong enough to strip paint. It was the first meal they shared, and it established a pattern that would hold through the weeks to come. Silas eating with methodical attention, his eyes on the windows. Gideon eating while reading his pencil, leaving faint marks in the margins. Josiah eating like a man who had not had a full meal in 6 weeks because he had not, and filling the silences with questions. Where are you from? He asked Eliza. Boston. What is it like? Crowded, cold, gray. Sounds terrible. Parts of it were. And you came all this way for a man you never met. Eliza wrapped her hands around the tin cup, feeling the heat move into her palms. I came for a life I had never had. The man was part of it, but it was more than that. I wanted to be somewhere I could breathe, somewhere I could start. Josiah nodded. His blue-gray eyes held understanding that was older than his 27 years. That is why our mother came to the mountains, he said. She used to say the high country does not care who you are or where you are from. It only cares whether you can survive in it. Could she? She survived everything except the smallpox. Josiah's smile faded into something quiet and inward. She taught Silas the mountains. Silas taught us. Eliza looked at the eldest brother. He had not spoken during this exchange, but he had stopped eating. His jaw was set. His amber eyes were fixed on something beyond the window that only he could see. And Eliza understood that the thing he was seeing was not a view, but a memory. "I am sorry about your mother," she said. Silas nodded once, sharp, brief. The nod of a man who accepted condolence the way he accepted weather as something that came and went and could not be changed. Then he picked up his cup and moved to the storeroom without another word. But something had shifted. The first hairline crack in the wall between them had appeared, and through it, the faintest light. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was equal parts routine and reckoning. Eliza opened the store each morning at 7. By 7:15, someone had found a reason to peer through the window or wander inside, not to buy, but to stare. To see the Eastern girl and her 3 mountain men. To gather material for the conversations that ran through Silver Falls like underground water, invisible but always present. The brothers worked within the boundaries Eliza had set. Silas discovered that the store's back wall was rotting from water damage, a slow decay that Clayton had either missed or lacked the skill to repair. Without being asked, Silas stripped the damaged boards, found sound timber from a fallen pine behind the building, and rebuilt the entire wall in 2 days. The joinery was precise, the cuts clean, each board fitted against its neighbor with the kind of craftsmanship that required no nails. Eliza watched him work through the storeroom window and found herself noticing the way his hands moved, large and calloused and surprisingly gentle, shaping the wood with a patience that seemed at odds with the intensity in his eyes. Gideon rebuilt the finances. He presented Eliza with a restructuring plan, written in handwriting, so precise it looked typeset: new supplier contracts, revised pricing strategies, a credit collection schedule that was firm but fair. When she read it and looked up at him with something like amazement, he said only, "We are in this together. Your failure is our failure, so do not fail." Josiah handled the customers. Despite the hostility, despite the stares and the whispers and the occasional slur muttered just loud enough to be heard, he met every person who walked through the door with steady, unshakable kindness. He remembered names after hearing them once. He carried heavy purchases to wagons for elderly women. He asked miners about their claims with genuine interest and complimented children on their hats. Slowly, grudgingly, some of the hostility began to soften. Not all, not most, but some. And some was enough to keep the doors open. On the 3rd night, Eliza came downstairs for water and found Josiah sitting alone in the darkness of the storeroom, his hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking. He was crying, silently, desperately, the way a man cries when he has been holding it together for too long and the seams have finally given way. He did not know she was there. She stood in the shadows of the hallway, her hand pressed against her mouth to keep her own grief from spilling out. And she watched the youngest brother let go of everything he had been carrying since the day they put the rope around his neck. She did not interrupt him. She did not need to. Witnessing it was enough. Because standing there in the dark, listening to Josiah Calloway cry like a boy who had just been told the world was not fair and was only now believing it, Eliza knew with absolute certainty that these 3 men had not killed Edmund Thorne. Killers did not cry like that in the dark when they thought no one was watching. On the 5th day, Josiah was carrying a barrel of flour that was overfull, and the lid was loose, and the whole thing split open across the storeroom floor in a white explosion that covered him from hair to boots. He stood in the middle of the clouds, 6 feet 5 inches of powdered mountain man, his expression so purely astonished that Eliza laughed. Really laughed. From deep in her stomach, the kind of laugh that hurt and healed at the same time. It was the first time she had laughed like that since her mother was alive. Josiah stared at her, then at himself, then back at her, and then he was laughing too. And Gideon, who never laughed, cleared his throat to disguise a smile pulling at his mouth, and even Silas, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch. It was a small moment. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. But it mattered. It mattered because it proved that joy was still possible in this place between these people in the middle of this possible situation, and that proof was worth more than gold. The trust built slowly the way mountains build layer by invisible layer. On the 7th evening after the store closed, the 4 of them sat in the small kitchen upstairs with cornbread, Eliza had baked and coffee that Gideon had learned to brew to her exact preference. Josiah asked Eliza about Boston. She told them about the garment factory, about her mother dying of tuberculosis, about her father drinking himself into the grave. She did not dramatize. She did not seek pity. She told it the way she told everything, straight and clear and honest. In return, Silas told them about his mother. His voice was rough when he spoke gravel over iron, but he did not stop. He told them how she used to wake him before dawn to watch the way the mist rose off Stillwater Creek, how she called it the mountain breathing. He told them how she made medicine from bark and root that the doctor in town said was nonsense, but that cured Josiah's fever when nothing else would. He told them how she sang in a language he could only half remember, now songs about rivers and stars and the old places where her people had lived before the borders came. He told them how she died in the spring, when the snow was melting and the world was supposed to be coming back to life, and how he had dug her grave himself because the ground was still half frozen and no one else would help. He told them how he was 14 and alone with two boys, one 10 and one 6, and how he taught himself to be a father and a mother and a brother all at once because there was no one else to do it. He did not look at Eliza while he spoke, but when he finished, the silence in the kitchen was the kind of silence that holds people together rather than pushing them apart. On the ninth day, a man named Carl Dempsey came into the store drunk at 11 in the morning. He saw Josiah behind the counter and began shouting about half-breeds and murderers in decent people's stores. Before Eliza or Josiah could respond, Silas appeared from the storeroom. He did not shout. He did not raise a fist. He simply stood in the doorway and then looked at Dempsey with amber eyes that held a quiet, controlled intensity that was far more frightening than any threat. Dempsey's face went white. He stumbled backward, knocking over a display of tinned goods, and fled into the street without another word. Silas returned to the storeroom without looking at anyone. But Eliza noticed his hands. They were trembling not from fear, but from the effort of holding back the fury that had risen in him when Dempsey directed his hatred at Josiah. It was the rage of protection, the same rage that had made him fight Thorne's gunmen, the same rage that would make him walk through fire for the people he considered his to defend. And Eliza realized, watching those trembling hands disappear into the storeroom, that she had somehow become one of those people. 2 days later, she was reaching for a bolt of navy fabric on the highest shelf, stretching on her toes with her fingers just brushing the edge. Silas appeared beside her without a sound, the way he always moved, and his arm reached past her, his chest close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the pine and leather, and something sharper underneath clean sweat and wood smoke. His hand closed around the bolt and pulled it down easily, and in the motion his forearm brushed her shoulder. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. The air in those 2 seconds felt different from the air in the rest of the room, charged and heavy with something that had no name and no permission to exist. Then Silas set the fabric on the counter, stepped back, and returned to the storeroom without a word. Eliza stood still for 10 more seconds, her heart beating in her throat, understanding with sudden and terrifying clarity that the distance between them had been shrinking for days and that she did not want it to stop. While trust grew inside the store, the investigation grew alongside it. Gideon had been reading Clayton Porter's ledger from the first day, and what he found in its margins led them deeper into a conspiracy that stretched from Silver Falls to Helena and back. 3 documents emerged from Clayton's papers. A receipt showing that Clayton had sold lumber to Edmund Thorne for a fencing project on the land the Calloways refused to sell. Thorne had been planning to take their property for at least 2 years. A letter from the Territorial Land Office in Helena, dated 6 months before Thorne's death, denying Thorne's petition to claim the Callaway land under eminent domain. The petition had been co-signed by Judge Harlan Graves. A letter never sent addressed to a Mrs. M. Thorne in Helena. The opening line read, "Dear Margaret, I believe your husband's death was not what they say it was. I am gathering evidence, and I hope you will." The letter stopped there mid-sentence. Clayton Porter had been killed before he could finish it, and a newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle, reporting Thorne's death. The article was brief: body found in a ravine, skull fractured, no witnesses. But at the bottom, in faint pencil, someone had written a single word: staged. "That is not Clayton's handwriting," Eliza said, squinting at the pencil mark under the lamplight. "No," Gideon said. "It belongs to Emmett Beckett, the newspaper editor. I recognize it from a survey report he published on our land claim 2 years ago. Small, precise letters. Eliza visited Beckett at the printing press on the east side of town the following morning. The shop smelled of ink and oil, and the particular loneliness of a man who had stopped trusting his own voice. Beckett was thin with ink-stained fingers and eyes that looked like they had not rested properly in months. He told her everything. Wade Henley had brought the body in, said he found Thorne at the bottom of a ravine, but the body was too clean. No dirt in the mouth or nose, no scraping on the palms. A man who falls into a ravine does not land like that. A man who is placed there does. I went to Judge Graves, Beckett said, told him I had questions. He said the case was closed, said if I kept stirring things up, I would lose my printing license. Beckett's mouth twisted with self-contempt. So I stopped asking. Wrote the article the way they wanted, and I have hated myself for it ever since, or what? No. I need you to testify at the hearing, Eliza said. If I do that, Graves will bury me. If you do not, 3 innocent men die, and you will carry that on top of everything else. Beckett stared at her. Then he nodded. All right, I will do it. As Eliza turned to leave, Beckett called after her. Miss Whitmore, there is one more thing. A woman came through town about a month ago asking questions at the land office. Dark traveling clothes, silver hair, carried herself like money. She asked about Edmund Thorne's estate records, and the judge told Frank Aldridge to refuse her access. I never got her name, but I got the feeling she was not done asking. Eliza filed the information away and left. She did not yet know who the silver-haired woman was. She would find out soon enough. That same evening, a knock came at the store's back door after dark. Ruth Dawson stood in the cold, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her face wet with tears. She was the wife of Lyle Dawson, the executioner, and she carried a secret that had been eating her alive. Her husband had come home drunk one night and talked. He talked about how Wade Henley and another man had brought Thorne's body to the judge's office in the middle of the night, about how Thorne had been dead for hours before they cracked his skull to make it look like murder, about how Judge Graves had paid them to stage the scene in the ravine. Why are you telling me this now? Eliza asked. Because I have a son, Ruth said. He is 12 years old, and I think about what kind of man he will become if his mother stays silent while innocent people die. Will you testify? Ruth nodded through her tears. Yes, God help me. Yes. The third witness came from the undertaker's shop. Eliza and Silas went together after midnight, moving through the back alleys of Silver Falls like shadows. Cornelius Marsh, gaunt and hollow-eyed, confirmed what the others had suspected. The skull fracture on Thorne's body had not bled properly. A living man's head wound bleeds heavily. Thorne's had been dry. The blood had settled before the injury occurred, which meant Thorne was already dead when someone cracked his skull. I told Judge Graves, Marsh said. He told me I was mistaken. Will you testify? Eliza asked. Silas spoke from the doorway, his voice low and hard. If you do not, 3 men die for something they did not do, and you will prepare the bodies. You will put us in the ground knowing you could have stopped it. Marsh flinched, then he nodded. Walking back through the dark streets, Eliza and Silas moved close together, their shoulders nearly touching. The night air was sharp with frost and carried the clean bite of pine from the mountains above. Thank you for coming with me, Eliza said. You did not give me a choice. I do not recall forcing you. The corner of Silas's mouth twitched. You are stubborn. I prefer determined. Stubborn. They reached the store. Silas opened the back door and stepped aside. Tommy let her pass. In the doorway, their eyes met. The space between them was measured in inches, and the air in those inches felt different than the air everywhere else, warmer and heavier, and charged with something that neither of them was ready to name. Good night, Silas. Good night, Eliza. She went upstairs. He stayed in the dark, and both of them lay awake for a long time, listening to the building settle around them, aware that the distance between their rooms had grown smaller in a way that had nothing to do with the number of steps. They had 2 weeks before the hearing. They planned carefully. Gideon drafted the legal strategy. Eliza prepared the witnesses. Silas reinforced the store's security. Josiah tracked the movements of Graves' men from the windows. Then on the 8th day, a boy delivered an envelope sealed with the judge's stamp. Notice of expedited hearing. The review of the indenture contracts is hereby moved to 3 days hence. Failure to appear will result in immediate forfeiture and reinstatement of original sentencing. 3 days, not 14. 3. He knows we are building a case. Gideon said, his face pale. The letter to Helena will not arrive in time, Eliza said. She had sent a request to the Territorial Land Office for records proving Thorne's illegal land grab records that existed beyond Graves' control, but the mail took a week each way. We go with what we have, Silas said. That night, while the brothers slept in shifts, Eliza sat at Clayton's desk and went through his papers one final time. She read every receipt, every letter, every margin note, running her fingers over the dead man's handwriting, as though she could pull his voice from the ink. And she found it, tucked between 2 pages of a supply invoice folded so small it was nearly invisible. A bank slip, a deposit receipt from the Silver Falls Savings and Loan, $5,000. Deposited into the personal account of Judge Harlan Graves, dated November 12th, by 9 days after Edmund Thorne's death. Eliza stared at the slip. Her hands were shaking. $1,000. The price of a man's life paid in cow and filed in a dead man's papers like a receipt for lumber. She brought it to Gideon at dawn. He read it 3 times, each reading slower than the last, and when he looked up, there was fire in his hazel eyes. This is it, he said. This is everything. That night, Eliza could not sleep. She went downstairs and found Silas sitting on the storeroom floor, his back against the wall, his eyes open in the dark. The moonlight through the window caught the scar across his ribs and turned it silver. Cannot sleep either, she asked. Have not slept properly in months. She sat across from him, pulling Clayton's coat around her shoulders against the cold. The distance between them was the width of the storeroom, 6 feet of wooden floor, in a silence that felt both too wide and not wide enough. Can I ask you something, Eliza said. You have been asking me things since the day we met. Do not see why you would stop now. Why did you not run before the arrest, before any of this? You knew Thorne was dead. You knew they would come for you. Why did you not disappear into the mountains? Silas was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was careful, like a man walking across thin ice. My mother used to say that a man who runs from the truth runs from himself. And a man who runs from himself has nowhere left to go. He paused. I thought about it. Thought about taking my brothers north across the border into Canada. We would have survived. We know those mountains better than anyone alive. But if I run, I am guilty, in their eyes and in my own, and I am not guilty. You would rather die innocent than live guilty. Something like that. That is the most stubborn thing I have ever heard. Coming from you, that is saying something. They sat in the dark and the silence between them changed. It became warmer, less like distance and more like shelter. Eliza. It was the first time he had used her first name outside of a goodbye. The sound of it in his rough voice, spoken deliberately and with weight, made her breath catch. Yes. If this does not work, if Graves wins, I want you to know that what you did buying our lives, fighting for us, no one has ever done anything like that for me. For us. I do not have the words for what that means. Then do not use words. He looked at her across 6 feet of dark floor, and she looked at him, and what passed between them was stronger than anything language could carry. Recognition. Gratitude. The first trembling thread of something that might, given time and safety, become love. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. The moment was enough. Good night, Silas. Good night, Eliza. She went upstairs. He stayed in the dark, and both of them understood that whatever happened at the hearing, this thing between them was worth fighting for. Before the hearing, Garrett Sinclair arrived. The attorney from Helena, representing the Thorne estate, came with 2 of Graves's men flanking him. He was older than Eliza expected, silver-haired and polished, with the smooth, confident voice of a man who had spent his career making unreasonable things sound perfectly reasonable. He offered to buy the indenture contracts. $300, the full amount she had paid, plus $150 in compensation. $450 to walk away. No debt, no risk, no fight. What happens to them if I sell? Eliza asked. They would be remanded to custody pending the appeal. If the original sentences are reinstated, Sinclair paused with studied delicacy. Well, the law is the law. So they hang. That would be for the court to decide. $450. More money than Eliza had ever held. Enough to leave Silver Falls, buy a train ticket east, start over in a city where nobody knew her name or her choices. She thought of Josiah crying in the dark, of Gideon's restructuring plan, written in handwriting so careful it looked like love, of Silas rebuilding the back wall with joinery that needed no nails, his hands shaping wood with a patience that seemed impossible for a man who had been ready to die 2 weeks ago. She thought of the moment on the storeroom floor in the dark, 6 feet of silence between them, and the way his voice had sounded when he said her name. "No," she said. Sinclair left with a warning that sounded like a threat. Eliza locked the door behind him and turned to find Silas standing close, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "You could have taken the money," he said. "I could have. Why did you not?" "Because I gave my word." Something in Silas's expression shifted. A wall that had been standing for as long as he could remember crumbled, not all at once but in a single decisive fracture that changed the entire structure. He nodded once, and the nod carried more meaning than any words he could have spoken, because it was the nod of a man who had just decided to trust someone completely and was terrified by how right it felt. The morning of the hearing, Eliza dressed with the particular care of a woman preparing for battle. Her best dress clean and pressed, her mother's cameo brooch at her throat, her hair pinned back severe and neat. She looked in the small mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. That woman had edges. They walked to the courthouse together, Eliza in front, Silas at her right shoulder, Gideon at her left, Josiah behind. 4 people who had nothing except the truth and each other, walking toward a stone building where a corrupt judge sat behind a bench he had no right to occupy. The courtroom was packed, every bench filled, people standing against the walls, crowding the doorway, craning their necks. Judge Graves presided from the bench in his black robe, his expression serene, his hands folded. Garrett Sinclair sat at the prosecution table. Wade Henley stood near the back door with his hand resting on his pistol. Sinclair presented the Thorne estate's case with polished efficiency. Procedural irregularities, insufficient restitution, insufficient oversight. He spoke for 20 minutes, and every word was a nail driven into a coffin that Graves had been building since the day he decided the Calloway brothers were worth more dead than alive. Then Graves turned to Eliza. "Miss Whitmore, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Eliza stood. Her hands were shaking beneath the table, but when she lifted them, they were steady. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." She called Emmett Beckett first. The newspaper editor walked to the front of the courtroom on legs that trembled, but his voice held as he described the inconsistencies: the body too clean, the hands unscraped, the absence of dirt. A dead man who had been placed, not fallen. She called Ruth Dawson next. Ruth's hands shook and her voice cracked on every third word, but she did not stop. She told the court what her husband had confessed, that the body had been moved, that the skull was fractured after death, that Judge Graves had paid for the staging. She called Cornelius Marsh. The undertaker spoke in the flat clinical tone of a man describing the evidence of his own profession. The wound that did not bleed the blood that had settled before injury, the unmistakable signs that Edmund Thorne was dead before anyone touched his skull. Then Josiah stood, the youngest brother who had been silent through the entire hearing, who had sat with his head bowed and his hands folded, while his older brother's lives were debated by strangers. "Your Honor," he said, "I would like to add something." Graves looked like he had bitten into something sour. "What?" "My brothers were with Samuel Blackwood 20 miles north of town when Thorne died. I know this because I was alone at our cabin and I nearly froze to death in the storm that hit that night. The storm of November 8th. Ask anyone in this room. That storm dropped 2 feet of snow in 6 hours. The roads were impassable for 3 days." He paused, letting the arithmetic settle. "If my brothers were 20 miles north during the worst storm of the season and the roads were blocked for 72 hours afterward, how exactly did they travel to Thorne's property 10 miles south of town to kill a man whose body was found the morning of November 9th? Josiah looked directly at Graves. "The timeline does not work. It never did. But nobody asked the question because you did not want them to." The courtroom stirred. People exchanged glances. Everyone in Silver Falls remembered the storm of November 8th. Then Eliza pulled out the bank receipt. "This is a deposit record from the Silver Falls Savings and Loan," she said, holding it up so the light caught the ink. $5,000 deposited into Judge Harlan Graves's personal account on November 12th, 5 days after Edmund Thorne's death. The courtroom went absolutely still. The kind of silence that has weight that presses against the walls and the windows and the chests of everyone in the room. The amount matches the value of Edmund Thorne's land holdings if sold at auction. Eliza continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. The land was auctioned 3 weeks after his death, purchased by a holding company in Helena. The commission was processed through this court. She turned to face the room, not just the judge, everyone. Edmund Thorne was murdered because he was in the way. His land was worth more than his life. The Calloway brothers were framed because they were convenient. Men with no allies, no voice, no one to defend them. She looked directly at Graves. Until now. Emmett Beckett stood first. His voice shook, but his words did not. I heard what she said. I saw the bank records. If there is a crime in this room, it was not committed by Miss Whitmore. Ruth Dawson rose next, tears on her cheeks. He is right. I have been afraid for years. But I am more afraid of what happens if we all stay silent. Cornelius Marsh, a miner named Thomas Garrett, a carpenter named Callum O'Brien. One by one, people in the courtroom stood, not everyone, not most, but enough. Enough that the room felt different. Enough that the balance of power, which had belonged entirely to the man behind the bench for 12 years, shifted. Graves slammed his gavel. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. This hearing is adjourned, he said, his voice stripped of its usual smoothness, revealing the cold iron underneath. I will render my decision within 48 hours. Until then, the Calloways remain under Miss Whitmore's custody. Any violation will result in the arrest of all parties. He swept from the bench without looking at anyone and disappeared through the side door. The courtroom emptied slowly, people filing out in clusters of 2 and 3, arguing and whispering and processing what they had just witnessed. Eliza stood at the defense table, the bank receipt still in her hand, her body vibrating with the residual electricity of what she had done. She did not know if it was enough. She did not know if anything could be enough against a man who controlled the courtroom and the law and the machinery of power in this town. Silas touched her elbow. The contact was light, barely there, but she felt it through every nerve in her body. We need to go, he said. They walked back to the store through streets that hummed with the tension of a community splitting down its center. Some people nodded at Eliza as she passed. Others turned away. The town of Silver Falls was choosing Podden, and the choosing was not over, and the next 48 hours would determine whether the side Eliza had staked her life on would hold. At the store, Josiah broke the silence. You were magnificent, he said. His blue-gray eyes were bright. Eliza managed a shaky smile. I was terrified. Same thing, Gideon said quietly. And for the first time since she had known him, Gideon Calloway smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes and softened the analytical precision of his face into something warm and human and unexpectedly beautiful. Silas said nothing. But when Eliza looked at him, his expression was open in a way she had never seen. The walls were down. The amber eyes that had been guarded and watchful since the moment she first saw them on the scaffold were looking at her now with something that went beyond gratitude, beyond respect, beyond the careful alliance of two people fighting a common enemy. He was looking at her the way a man looks at the horizon when he realizes it is not the edge of the world but the beginning of one. Eliza held his gaze, and the space between them, which had been shrinking day by day, narrowed again. Not to nothing, not yet, but to something small enough that both of them could feel the warmth of what was waiting on the other side. 48 hours. Judge Graves had 48 hours to make his decision, and desperate men with 48 hours were the most dangerous creatures alive. The waiting had begun. 2 days passed like wounded animals dragging themselves toward a place to die. Eliza kept the store closed. There was no point in opening it. Half the town would not come in, and the other half would come only to stare, and she did not have the energy for either. She needed every ounce of what was left in her for what was coming, though she did not yet know what that would be. The brothers stayed inside. Silas positioned himself near the front window where he could watch the street without being seen, his body angled against the wall, his amber eyes tracking every movement with the patient focus of a man who had spent his life reading landscapes for danger. Gideon sat at the counter with Clayton's papers spread before him, reviewing the evidence one final time, searching for anything they might have missed. Josiah moved between the storeroom and the kitchen, keeping busy with his hands. because keeping busy was the only way he knew how to keep the fear from settling into his bones. Samuel Blackwood, Silas's oldest friend, camped in the alley behind the building. He was a crow trapper and trader, 46 years old, with hands that had set 10,000 snares and a face that gave away nothing. He carried a journal of every trade, every camp, every day spent in the high country, and the entry for November 7th through 10th confirmed what the brothers had claimed: 4 days at Stillwater Creek, 32 beaver pelts, Silas present, from sunrise to sundown. Blackwood did not speak much. He did not need to. His presence in the alley was a statement, and the statement was, "You will not take them without going through me." On the morning of the third day, a messenger arrived. A boy 12 years old holding an envelope sealed with red wax. Eliza took it at the door, pressed a coin into the boy's hand, and closed the door before breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in the careful, controlled hand of Judge Harlan Graves. The court has reviewed the evidence and testimony presented at the hearing. After careful consideration, the indenture contracts between Eliza Whitmore and the Calloway brothers are hereby voided due to procedural irregularities and insufficient oversight. Effective immediately, Silas Gideon and Josiah Calloway are remanded to territorial custody pending execution of the original sentences. They are to surrender themselves to the sheriff's office no later than noon today. Failure to comply will result in the arrest of all parties. The paper slipped from Eliza's fingers and drifted to the floor. She watched it fall with the detached clarity of a person watching something break that cannot be repaired. Silas picked it up, read it, his jaw set like stone, the muscles in his neck drawing tight as cables. "He is calling our bluff," he said. It was not a bluff. Eliza's voice came out hollow, stripped of everything except exhaustion. "We presented everything we had. Every witness, every document, the bank receipt. It was not enough." "It was enough to scare him," Gideon said from the counter, his voice quiet and precise. "That is exactly why he is forcing this now. Before we can gather more support, before the letter from Helena arrives, before the story spreads beyond this town to places he cannot control." Josiah stood at the bottom of the stairs, his face white. For a moment, he looked exactly like the boy on the scaffold, young and terrified, and trying with everything he had not to show it. Then his jaw tightened, and the boy disappeared, and what remained was a man who had decided that fear did not get to make his choices. "What do we do?" he asked. Silas's voice was hard and certain. "We do not surrender." Eliza looked at him. "If you do not, they come for you, for all of us. Then let them come. And let the whole town see what justice looks like when it sends armed men to drag 3 innocent brothers to the gallows." Gideon stood slowly from the counter. "He is right. If we go quietly, we die quietly and nothing changes. If we force them to come get us in daylight in front of witnesses, it forces the town to choose. It makes the injustice visible. You cannot look away from something that happens on your doorstep." "It could also get us all killed," Eliza said. "Could," Silas agreed. "Or it could be the thing that finally breaks this open." Eliza looked at the 3 of them. These brothers who had been strangers 3 weeks ago and were now the closest thing to family she had known since her mother died. Silas, whose quiet intensity had become the steadiest thing in her world. Gideon, whose mind worked like a clock and whose loyalty, once given, was absolute. Josiah, whose warmth had thawed something inside her that she had not realized was frozen. And Silas. She came back to Silas. The man with amber eyes who challenged her and protected her and looked at her like she was the first true thing he had seen in a lifetime of lies. "All right," she said, "we stay." They spent the next hour preparing for whatever was coming. Eliza wrote letters. To Emmett Beckett, documenting everything they had uncovered. To the territorial governor and Helena, detailing the corruption, the staged murder, the rigged tribunal. To Margaret Thorne, the widow who had left Silver Falls after her husband's death, whose address Gideon had found in Clayton Porter's correspondence. She sealed each letter and gave them to Samuel Blackwood through the back door. "If this goes wrong," Eliza told him, "make sure the truth survives. Even if we do not." Blackwood looked at her with an expression she could not read. Then he nodded. "You have spine, Miss Whitmore, more than most men I have met." "I have fear," Eliza said, "but I have learned that fear does not get to decide what happens next." Noon arrived, the clock in the courthouse tower visible through the store's front window, struck 12 times, each strike falling through the silence like a stone dropped into deep water. Wade Henley appeared at the far end of Main Street. He was not alone. 5 armed men flanked him, spread in a loose formation that covered the width of the street. They moved slowly, deliberately, with the practiced coordination of men who had done this before. Henley walked at the center, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his flat eyes fixed on the store. Inside, the brothers had positioned themselves without a word spoken. Silas at the front window, his body angled to see the street while presenting the smallest possible target. Gideon at the back door, covering the alley, a length of iron pipe in his hand. Josiah near the storeroom where he could move quickly in any direction. Eliza stood behind the counter, Clayton Porter's ledger pressed against her chest, the leather warm from her hands. Calloway's, Henley's voice carried through the closed door, flat and loud and devoid of anything resembling humanity. You are in violation of a court order. Come out peacefully and no one gets hurt. Silence. Miss Whitmore, you are harboring fugitives. Open this door or we will break it down. Eliza walked to the door. She could feel the brother's eyes on her back, could feel Silas tense behind her, every muscle in his body coiled against the instinct to step in front of her. But she reached the door first and she opened it herself and she stood in the threshold. 5 feet 3 inches of a mail-order bride from Boston in a navy blue dress with dust on the hem and a cameo brooch at her throat, facing down 6 armed men in a dirt street in Montana territory. The Calloway brothers are not fugitives, she said. Her voice carried across the street and into the crowd that was already gathering on the boardwalks drawn from shops and homes by the sound of authority being challenged. The court ruling is unjust, and we are appealing through proper channels. Henley's expression did not change. There is no appeal. The judge's word is final. Not if the judge is corrupt. Step aside, Miss Whitmore. No. The standoff stretched. Seconds ticked past like hours. Eliza could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the pulse in her throat where her mother's brooch rested. Behind Henley, the crowd was growing. Shopkeepers in aprons. Miners in dirt-caked boots. Women with children on their hips. Emmett Beckett with his notebook open, his pen moving. Ruth Dawson clutching her shawl, her 12-year-old son Phineas, standing beside her with his jaw set in an expression that was a mirror of his mother's courage. Cornelius Marsh standing straight for perhaps the first time in years. Last chance, Henley said. Eliza did not move. Then a voice rang out from the edge of the crowd, clear and sharp and carrying the weight of authority that did not come from a badge or a gun, but from something older and more powerful. Wait! Everyone turned. A woman walked through the crowd. She was older, perhaps 53, elegantly dressed in traveling clothes that spoke of Helena, or farther with steel gray hair pinned beneath a hat and eyes that missed nothing. She moved with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had spent her life in rooms where decisions were made and had learned that the people who rushed were usually the ones who lost. Eliza recognized the description before she knew the name. Silver hair, dark traveling clothes, carried herself like money. The woman Beckett had told her about, the one who had come asking questions and been turned away. Beside her walked Garrett Sinclair. The attorney from Helena looked different than he had during his last visit. The Polish was still there, but the predatory confidence was gone, replaced by something grimmer and more conflicted. He looked like a man who had recently learned something about the side he was working for and did not like what he had found. And behind them, both 2 men in long coats with federal marshal badges glinting in the midday sun. Stand down, Mr. Henley, Sinclair said. His voice was different too, quieter, the voice of a man who had changed his mind about something important. Henley frowned. On whose authority? On mine, the woman said. She stepped forward and the crowd parted for her, the way water parts around stone, not because she pushed, but because her presence demanded it. My name is Margaret Thorne. I am Edmund Thorne's widow, and I have something to say. The street went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Margaret Thorne looked at Eliza, then at the brothers visible through the store windows, then at the gathered crowd of Silver Falls, the town where her husband had lived and schemed and died. I have been living in Helena since my husband's death, she said. I left because I could not bear to stay in a place where the truth was buried along with his body. But I did not stop looking for that truth. When Mr. Sinclair informed me of Miss Whitmore's accusations against Judge Graves, I spent 3 days reviewing my late husband's financial records and personal correspondence. She reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a sheaf of papers bound with a ribbon. These are letters between my husband and Judge Graves. They detail a business arrangement to acquire land through legal manipulation, intimidation, and judicial corruption spanning 4 years. My husband was not a good man. I have made my peace with that. But he did not deserve to be murdered, and the men accused of killing him did not do it. She turned to the Calloway brothers. I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe you the truth. Margaret handed the letters to Eliza, who took them with hands that shook not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of vindication arriving at the last possible moment. Judge Graves orchestrated my husband's death, Margaret continued. Her voice was steady, controlled the voice of a woman who had practiced these words until they could not hurt her anymore. He hired men to kill Edmund and staged the scene to frame the Calloway brothers. He did this to gain control of the land and the associated profits. I have signed statements from those men obtained at considerable personal expense confessing to their roles. She turned to the marshals. I have filed formal charges with the territorial court in Helena. These gentlemen are here to execute the warrant. The crowd erupted. Voices crashed against each other like waves against rock. Henley stepped back, his hand falling away from his pistol, his face slack with the sudden disorientation of a man whose entire chain of command had just been severed. The deputies behind him looked at each other with the wide eyes of men realizing they had been following a murderer's orders. Before anyone could restore order, before the marshals could move forward, before the crowd could process what they had heard, a sound split the air like the earth cracking open. A gunshot. Everyone scattered. Eliza hit the ground instinctively, her hands over her head, her cheek pressed against the wooden threshold of the store. Screams, running boots. The metallic echo of the shot rolling down the street and bouncing off the stone walls of the courthouse. Through the chaos, Eliza raised her head and saw him. Judge Harlan Graves stood at the far end of Main Street. He had come out through the side door of the courthouse, the door that led to his private chambers, the door no one watched because no one expected the judge to run. His black coat was unbuttoned. His silver-streaked hair was disordered for the first time in Eliza's memory, and in his right hand, held with the rigid certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose, was a revolver. His face was a mask of fury and something worse than fury. Desperation. The raw, naked panic of a man watching the world he had spent 12 years constructing collapse around him in real time, stone by stone, lie by lie, until there was nothing left to stand on. And beneath the desperation, Eliza saw the same exhaustion she had glimpsed on the scaffold that first day, the weariness of a man who had been carrying secrets and debts and a sick wife's medical bills, and the weight of every compromise that had led him from a struggling judge to a murderer, and who had finally run out of the strength to pretend any of it had been worth the cost. This ends now, Graves shouted. His voice cracked on the last word, losing the smooth judicial cadence that had been his weapon, and his shield revealing underneath it the voice of a frightened man pretending to be powerful. He raised the gun. He aimed at Silas, the eldest Calloway brother, the one who had refused to sell, the one whose defiance had started the chain of events that led to this moment, the one who stood in the doorway of Porter's Mercantile, with his amber eyes locked on the barrel of the gun and his body positioned between the bullet and the woman behind him. Eliza did not think. Thinking would have stopped her. Thinking would have calculated the odds, measured the distance, weighed the risk, and arrived at the reasonable conclusion that stepping in front of a loaded gun held by a desperate man was the single most reckless act a person could commit. Thinking would have kept her on the ground behind the threshold safe. But Eliza Whitmore had not crossed a continent, buried her hopes, spent her last dollar, fought a corrupt judge, and fallen in love with a man she bought off a scaffold just to hide behind a doorframe while someone pulled a trigger. She moved. One step forward, then another, placing herself between the gun and Silas Calloway, her chin lifted in the gesture her mother had taught her, her cornflower blue eyes locked on the barrel, her body small and straight and absolutely refusing to move. Eliza, no! Silas's voice was raw, stripped of every defense he had ever built, cracked open to the core. He reached for her, his hands closing on her shoulders, trying to pull her back, but she was already there, already standing in the space between the bullet and the man she had chosen, and she would not be moved. The shot never came. Samuel Blackwood materialized from the side street like a shadow given weight and purpose. He moved with the silent speed of a man who had spent 46 years learning to close distance without being detected, and his hand caught Graves's wrist at the precise moment the judge's finger tightened on the trigger. The gun discharged upward. The bullet punched through empty sky and was gone. Graves stumbled. The revolver clattered to the dirt. Blackwood twisted the judge's arm behind his back with enough pressure to hold him, but not enough to break bone, though the look on Blackwood's face suggested the restraint cost him. "It is over," Blackwood said. Graves' face contorted. The mask was gone entirely now, and what remained was a man who had convinced himself that his cruelty served a higher purpose, and was only now understanding that the purpose had been a lie all along. "You have no authority here," Graves shouted, struggling against Blackwood's grip. "None of you do. I am the law in this town." "Not anymore," Margaret Thorne said. She stepped forward, her voice carrying the quiet, devastating finality of a verdict that could not be appealed. The marshals moved in. One of them produced iron manacles, the same kind that had held the Calloway brothers on the scaffold 3 weeks ago. There was a symmetry to it that no one missed. "Judge Harlan Graves," the marshal said, "you are under arrest by order of the Territorial Court of Montana for the murder of Edmund Thorne, the murder of Clayton Porter, conspiracy, corruption of judicial office, and obstruction of justice." The manacles clicked shut around Graves's wrists. The sound echoed through the silent street, a small metallic noise that carried the weight of 12 years of tyranny coming to an end. Graves stared at Eliza. His eyes held cold, bitter hatred, the hatred of a man who had been defeated by someone he considered beneath his notice. "You have destroyed this town," he said. "No," Eliza replied. Her legs were shaking so badly she could feel her knees threatening to buckle, but her voice was clear and steady, the voice of a woman who had found it 3 weeks ago on a dusty scaffold and had been learning to use it ever since. "I have given it a chance to build itself back." The marshals led Graves away. Wade Henley stood in the street watching his former master walk past in chains, and then slowly, with the careful deliberation of a man making a decision he should have made years ago, he unbuckled his gun belt and set it on the ground. "I am done," he said to no one in particular. The crowd did not cheer. This was not a moment for celebration. It was a moment for reckoning, for the slow, painful process of a community looking at itself and seeing for the first time what it had allowed to happen. Some faces held relief, some held shame, most held the complicated mixture of both that comes with the recognition that silence in the face of injustice is its own kind of guilt. Margaret Thorne approached Eliza. She took the younger woman's hand and held it with a grip that was firm and sure. "Miss Whitmore, I am sorry for everything, for what my husband did, for what the judge did, for how long it took me to act." "You are here now," Eliza said. "That is what matters." Margaret turned to the brothers. "I am authorizing the immediate dissolution of the indenture contracts. All 3 of you are free men. Your land claim is restored, your records cleared." She paused. "And I am transferring a sum from the Thorne estate to Miss Whitmore's account as restitution for the financial loss she incurred in saving your lives. It is the least I can do, and it is not enough, but it is a start." Josiah's face broke into a grin so wide and so real that it seemed to generate its own light. Gideon closed his eyes and exhaled a long, slow breath that released months of tension in a single sustained note of relief. Silas said nothing. He was looking at Eliza. The crowd began to thin. People drifted back to their shops and homes carrying the weight of what they had witnessed, beginning the watiun and uncertain work of deciding what kind of town they wanted to live in now that the man who had decided for them was gone. That evening, the 4 of them stood in the storeroom of Porter's Mercantile. The space felt different now. The same shelves, the same counter, the same walls. But the air had changed. It was lighter. It breathed. "We are free," Josiah said, as though testing the words, checking whether they were real. "We are free," Gideon confirmed. Josiah looked at Eliza. "What happens now?" Eliza considered the question. She looked around the store at the shelves Clayton Porter had stocked at the counter he had stood behind for 20 years at the ledger that had led them to the truth. She thought about the man she had never met, whose letters had brought her here, whose death had set everything in motion. "I have a store to run," she said, "and no stagecoach ticket back to Boston." "You will stay?" Josiah asked, hope naked in his voice. "I will stay." Gideon nodded with quiet satisfaction. "The restructuring plan I drafted projects profitability within 8 weeks if we implement immediately." Josiah grinned. He means he wants to stay too. I was building to that, Gideon said with dignity. I am not leaving either, Josiah declared. Just so everyone is clear, I am not leaving the three of you to run this place without somebody who actually knows how to talk to customers. Eliza laughed. The sound surprised all of them, including her, because it was full and free and carried no weight of grief or fear or obligation. It was the laugh of a woman who had found something worth staying for and was just beginning to understand how rare that was. Partners, she said, all four of us. Partners, Silas agreed. His voice was quiet, but the word carried everything. 6 months later, on an evening in late July when the mountains were purple against a sky that burned gold and amber, and the air smelled of pine in the first whisper of autumn, Silas and Eliza stood together on the front steps of the store. The sign above them was new. Whitmore and Callaway General Store, painted by Josiah with more enthusiasm than precision, but it was straight, which was an improvement over Clayton's crooked original. Eliza, Silas said. Something in his tone made her turn. He was looking at her. Not at the mountains, not at the street, not at the horizon he had spent his whole life measuring. Just at her. And his expression was open in a way that stopped her breath because Silas Callaway did not open easily, and what lay behind the walls he had built was not the hardness she might have expected, but something tender and uncertain and achingly human. You bought my life for $300, he said. I have been trying to figure out how to pay you back ever since. You do not owe me anything, Silas. I know, but I want to give you something anyway. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, resting on a piece of worn cloth, was a ring. It was simple, handmade, a band of silver with a small blue stone set into the center. The stone was the exact color of her eyes. I made it, he said. Josiah helped with the stone. Gideon told me I should probably ask you properly instead of just leaving it on the counter, which was my original plan. Eliza laughed, and the sound was the brightest thing in the fading light, brighter than the sky, brighter than in the mountains, brighter than anything either of them had ever known. Silas Callaway, she said, are you asking me to marry you? I am asking you to let me stay, permanently, not because of a contract or a debt or because the law says I have to, because you are the bravest person I have ever known, and because every morning when I wake up and hear you opening the store downstairs, I think that is home. That sound, that is where I belong. Eliza's eyes filled with tears that she did not try to stop. She took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit as though it had been made for her, which it had, because Silas had measured her finger while she slept by wrapping a piece of thread around it so gently she never stirred. Yes, she said. Silas smiled. A real smile, full and unguarded, the kind that transformed his weathered face from something fierce into something beautiful. He took her hands in his, and they stood there on the steps, two people who had found each other through violence and injustice and $300 in a stubbornness that would not quit. Through the window behind them, Gideon and Josiah were pretending not to watch and failing completely. The wedding was small. The whole town came anyway. Emmett Beckett wrote it up for the paper. Josiah cried more than anyone, including the bride. Gideon gave a toast that was exactly one sentence long. It took you long enough. Samuel Blackwood brought a gift of the finest beaver pelts in the territory and sat in the back row with his arms crossed and his face revealing nothing except, if you looked carefully, the faintest trace of a smile. 25 years later, the store was larger. They had bought the building next door and knocked through the wall. The sign read the same, Whitmore and Callaway General Store, repainted by Josiah, who had gotten considerably better at lettering. Silas had built a cabin on the mountain land. His mother had shown him 20 acres of pine and creek water, and he spent the summers there checking trap lines and walking the ridges with the slow, sure stride of a man who belonged to the country as much as the country belonged to him. His hair was silver at the temples now. His step was slower, but his hands were still steady, and when he held his first grandchild, a girl with her grandmother's blue eyes, those hands, the largest and most calloused hands Eliza had ever seen, trembled with a gentleness that made her weep. Gideon had taught himself law from borrowed books and had become the town's first legal advisor. He helped homesteaders with land claims and contracts, settlers with disputes, widows with estates. He never charged the people who could not afford to pay. He had married a schoolteacher named Adelaide who was the only person alive who could out-argue him, and their debates at the dinner table were legendary. Josiah had become the heart of Silver Falls. He organized the first harvest dance, coached the children's baseball team, and discovered a talent for wood carving that grew into a business. He had married Nettie Henderson, the young widow they hired at the store in the first year, in a quiet ceremony where Josiah had predictably cried. They had 3 children, all of whom inherited their father's auburn hair and their mother's practical sense. Judge Graves served 15 years in territorial prison. He died 6 months after his release alone in a boarding house in Butte. The obituary was 3 lines long. Emmett Beckett published the full story of the Silver Falls conspiracy, 12 pages, the longest article he ever wrote. It was reprinted in Helena Bozeman, Virginia City, and eventually the San Francisco Chronicle. He won no prizes, but he slept soundly for the first time in years. Ruth Dawson opened a dress shop on the east side of town. Her son Phineas, the boy who had stood beside her at the standoff with his jaw set like a man, grew up to study law under Gideon's guidance and eventually became the first honest judge Silver Falls had known. Eliza stood behind the counter of the store on a September morning, 25 years after she had stepped off a stagecoach into dust and grief and the beginning of everything. Her honey blonde hair showed threads of silver. Her face carried the lines of a woman who had laughed and worried and fought and loved in equal measure. She was writing in a journal, not letters to a dead man, but a record of the life she was living. She wrote about the new shipment of tools from Helena, about the argument she had with a difficult customer over the price of nails, about the way Silas had fixed the loose floorboard in the storeroom without being asked, the way he always fixed things without being asked, because caring for the things he loved was as natural to him as breathing. She wrote about Josiah's latest wood carving, a set of animals for the schoolroom, each one so detailed you could count the feathers on the birds, about Gideon's legal practice, which had grown into something real and respected a quiet force for fairness in a territory that was slowly and perfectly learning what fairness meant. She wrote about the ordinary miracle of waking up each morning and choosing to show up, choosing to matter, choosing to build something worth keeping. Outside Silver Falls went about its business. Imperfect, complicated, full of people trying their best and sometimes failing. But it was theirs, not one man's kingdom. A community held together by the messy, difficult, beautiful work of living honestly. Silas would be back by sunset. He had been checking the trap lines on the mountain, walking the land his mother had shown him, the land they had fought to keep. He would come through the door, smelling of pine and cold air, and she would have dinner waiting, and they would sit together in the kitchen above the store and talk about the day the way they had talked about every day for 25 years, with the easy intimacy of 2 people who had built a life from nothing and knew the value of every board and nail. Eliza closed the journal. She touched the cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's brooch, the only thing she had carried from Boston, and she went downstairs to open the store. Not because she was not afraid. Fear never fully left. It lived in the back of her mind like a scar that ached in cold weather, a reminder of the scaffold and the gun, and the moment she had stepped between a bullet and the man she loved. But she had learned something on that dusty platform in a town called Silver Falls, something that had taken her 25 years to fully understand. Fear does not get to decide what happens next. Courage does. And courage does not always look like standing in front of a gun. Sometimes it looks like opening a door. Sometimes it looks like saying good morning to people who used to look through you. Sometimes it looks like staying when every reasonable voice in your head tells you to run. The rope had been meant to end 3 lives. Instead, it began 4. 3 mountain brothers who learned that surviving was not the same as living, and that the difference was measured not in years, but in the people you chose to share them with. And 1 mail-order bride who traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger and ended up building a home with 3 men who taught her that the bravest thing a person can do is not to fight. It is to stay, to choose, to build, to love without condition and without retreat day after day, in the ordinary light of ordinary mornings until the ordinary becomes the most extraordinary thing of all. They chose this, every day, together. And outside the mountains watched, ancient, patient, enduring, the same mountains that had sheltered a Crow woman and her son, the same mountains that had hidden 3 brothers from a world that wanted them gone, the same mountains that had drawn a girl from Boston with nothing but a letter and a prayer, and the stubborn belief that somewhere on the other side of 2,000 miles of prairie and forest and stone, there was a place where she could finally stop disappearing and start being seen. The mountains did not judge. They did not forgive. They simply endured the way love endures, the way truth endures, the way the things that matter most endure long after the things that tried to destroy them have been forgotten. Eliza Whitmore Calloway opened the door of her store, flipped the sign to open in, and stepped into the morning light of a town that had once tried to hang the men she loved and had learned slowly and painfully and beautifully to be better. The bell above the door chimed, once clear and bright, and the day began.